The night the gunfire shattered the silence, nobody could have predicted that a single mistake in forensic science would ripple outward to destroy a man's life. The crime itself was brutal, quick, loud, and senseless, but what came after was even more haunting. An investigation built not on truth, but on a flawed science the courtroom trusted without hesitation. It began in a quiet suburban neighborhood where panic replaced peace in an instant. Officers rushed to the scene of a shooting that left a man dead and the community on edge. Witnesses described only flashes, muffled screams, and the echo of bullets cracking through the night. But it wasn't eyewitness accounts that would drive this case. It was the metallic evidence lying on the asphalt, spent shell casings, each one waiting to be examined under a forensic microscope. At the time, firearms analysis was treated like gospel in the criminal justice system. The premise was simple, convincing, and seemingly scientific. Every gun leaves behind unique marks. Microscopic fingerprints etched into the brass of a bullet casing or the grooves of a fired round. Analysts claimed they could match those marks to a specific weapon, narrowing the suspect list to one. And so, when the evidence arrived at the state crime lab, the analysts leaned over their comparison microscopes, peering through lenses at the delicate scratches and striations. They circled details with laser pointers, noting similarities that to the untrained eye seemed convincing. This casing, they later testified, was fired from the suspect's weapon, no doubt about it. But there was doubt, enormous doubt. Doubt the jury never heard. Doubt hidden beneath the veneer of authority that courtroom forensic testimony often carries. Because the truth, buried deep in peer-reviewed studies, was that firearms analysis is far from infallible. The discipline relies on human judgment, subjective comparison, and a leap of interpretation that science had never firmly validated. Yet none of that mattered as investigators zeroed in on their suspect, a young man with a troubled background, already under scrutiny for unrelated offenses, became the target. When police searched his home and found a handgun of similar caliber, the puzzle seemed complete. To the detectives, the forensics confirmed what their instincts told them. They had their shooter. The arrest was swift, the headlines immediate. Shooter caught through ballistics evidence blared the evening news, feeding the community a sense of resolution. But what nobody realized was that the clock had just begun ticking on a wrongful imprisonment, one rooted not in malice, but in misplaced faith in a science too fragile to carry the weight of certainty. As the jail doors clanged shut behind the accused, his mother whispered through tears, "You didn't do this. I know you didn't." But her voice was drowned out by the narrative already solidified in police reports and forensic testimony. And in that moment, the first fracture appeared, a man's life and freedom balancing on the delicate, unstable edge of forensic certainty. He sat across from his defense attorney in the county jail, staring at a stack of documents that seemed to seal his fate. The official firearms analysis report was filled with technical jargon, toolmark striations, microscopic congruence, sufficient agreement. But the last sentence was devastatingly clear. The bullets recovered from the scene were conclusively matched to the defendant's firearm. "How can they even say that?" he asked, his voice raw. "I didn't even fire the damn thing. That gun's been in my closet for months." The attorney leaned back, conflicted, because right now, the courts let them. Ballistics experts have testified in hundreds of cases, and juries believe them. It sounds scientific, but science was not on his side. The courtroom was, and that was enough to twist reality. The trial began under the weight of public pressure. The victim's family filled the gallery, their grief heavy and visible. Prosecutors spoke with righteous conviction, pointing to the defendant as a violent man who pulled the trigger. Their anchor was the firearms expert, who entered the courtroom with the air of authority. He described peering through microscopes, comparing casings side by side, and finding what he called a perfect match. Jurors leaned forward, captivated by the certainty in his tone. In the hushed silence of the courtroom, scientific-sounding testimony carried extraordinary weight. The defense cross-examined, probing cracks in the foundation, Isn't it true, they asked, that firearms analysis is not backed by the same rigorous standards as DNA testing? The expert smirked, dismissive. We've been doing this for decades. Our discipline is well accepted in the forensic community. The jury didn't hear about studies by the National Academy of Sciences that warned of the method's unreliability. They didn't hear about error rates, or the fact that the analysts could look at the same casings and reach different conclusions. Those warnings live in academic journals, far away from the drama of a murder trial. The defendant took the stand, his hands trembling. He pleaded his innocence, but his words were no match for the certainty the jury felt. When the prosecution replayed the firearms expert's testimony, in their minds, scientific proof, they thought, this has to be true. And when the verdict came down, it struck like a hammer. Guilty of murder, life behind bars. As the courtroom erupted, some with relief, others with quiet disbelief. The defendant's mother collapsed in the hallway. He was led away in shackles, glancing one last time at the world outside. But somewhere in the silence of the verdict lay an unspoken truth. The real killer was still free. Prison walls have a way of suffocating hope, but he refused to let despair consume him. Every night, he replayed the trial in his mind, clinging to the same burning question. How can they say the marks on a bullet are unique when they've never proven it? Inside his cell, he began reading legal briefs, forensic reports, any scraps of information his attorney could smuggle past the iron bars. He discovered research questioning firearms analysis, papers describing flawed methodologies, and testimony from experts who dared to break rank. One passage struck him like lightning. No studies have ever established that firearm tool marks are unique or that examiners can reliably make identifications to the exclusion of all other guns. The truth was in black and white, and yet it hadn't been heard in his trial. Outside the prison, advocates for forensic reform were gathering momentum. Innocence projects, legal clinics, and investigative journalists were exposing case after case where faulty science had led to wrongful convictions, bite mark analysis, hair comparison. Even arson investigations, fields once revered as rock solid, were collapsing under scrutiny. Firearms analysis was next in line. Years passed. He filed appeals, each one denied with the same refrain. The evidence presented at trial was sufficient. His mother aged visibly, her hair graying, her health fading, but her resolve never wavering. We're going to get you out, she promised during visits, her voice trembling with both hope and desperation. Then came a turning point. A new attorney, young and relentless, joined his case. She had read about systemic failures in forensic science and was determined to challenge the conviction. She filed motions demanding re-examination of the ballistics evidence, citing scientific reports that questioned the reliability of the method. The prosecution resisted, fiercely protecting the original verdict. But cracks were forming behind closed doors. Even some prosecutors admitted that forensic testimony once seen as unshakable was now under fire. And then, in a sterile laboratory far from the courtroom, an independent expert placed the disputed casings under a microscope. Hours later, she wrote her report. Her conclusion was stark. There is no scientific basis to claim these bullets came from the defendant's weapon. It was the first real glimmer of hope in years. But in the world of wrongful convictions, hope alone was never enough. The courtroom felt colder this time, as though justice itself was holding its breath. The motion for retrial had been granted, but only after a brutal legal battle. The defendant shuffled in, older, worn down by years behind bars, but with a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The new defense attorney began with a simple, devastating statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about murder anymore. It is about science saying how flawed science put an innocent man in prison. Jurors listened as the defense dismantled the original firearms testimony piece by piece. They introduced studies from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which revealed that firearm examiners often disagreed with each other. They explained that the supposed uniqueness of striation marks had never been scientifically validated. Most damning of all, the independent expert testified, "I cannot say, with any degree of scientific certainty, that these casings came from his weapon." She explained, "and no one else can either." The prosecution fought back. Clinging to the credibility of the original expert, they argued that firearms analysis had long been trusted. The juries across the nation had convicted based on similar evidence, but the defense had shifted the ground beneath their feet. This wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about a system. The jurors looked unsettled. Could it be true that for decades, convictions rested on evidence built more on tradition than science? Could it be that this man had lost years of his life because of a forensic illusion? When the judge ordered a recess, the defendant sat quietly, staring at his hands. He wasn't celebrating yet. Too many times he had been on the brink of freedom, only to be pulled back into despair. But for the first time, the balance of justice seemed to tilt not toward certainty, but toward doubt. And in a criminal trial, reasonable doubt was enough. The retrial stretched on, every moment tense, every witness a reminder of what had been stolen. Friends testified about his character, family members about his absence, and experts about the scientific revolution sweeping through forensics. The prosecutor's closing argument was forceful. The victim's family deserves justice. This man was convicted once already. The evidence is clear. But the defense's closing argument carried a haunting weight. Justice is not served by keeping an innocent man behind bars. Justice is not served when science is twisted into certainty. It cannot deliver. You don't have to believe he's innocent. You only have to see that the state cannot prove he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for hours that felt like years in the gallery. His mother gripped a rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. His attorney whispered, "Whatever happens, you fought. You exposed the truth." When the jurors filed back in, their expressions unreadable. The entire room froze. The foreperson stood, voice trembling. "We find the defendant not guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. The defendant closed his eyes, his body collapsing into relief and exhaustion. His mother wept openly, her cries echoing through the chambers. After years of confinement, he was free. But freedom could never return the time stolen from him, nor erase the nights he lay awake in a cell wondering if he would die there. The day he walked out of prison, the sky looked different, bluer, wider, almost unreal. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. "What do you want to say?" One shouted. He paused, his voice quiet but steady. "Don't let this happen again. Don't let flawed science take another life." In the months that followed, his case became a rallying cry for reform. Legal scholars dissected the trial, pointing to systemic failures. Lawmakers debated stricter standards for forensic testimony. Innocence advocates cited his story in their campaigns, warning that hundreds more might still languish in cells because of similar mistakes. But for him, life was not so easily repaired. Nights brought nightmares of steel bars slamming shut, of jurors staring with suspicion, of experts declaring certainty where none existed. Freedom was real, but so was the trauma. One evening, sitting on his porch, he stared at the horizon and whispered to himself, "They can let me out of prison, but they can't give me back what they took." And somewhere, in another courtroom, another jury listened to another firearms examiner swear under oath that a bullet casing was a match. The cycle continued, quietly, chillingly reminding us all that justice, once broken, does not easily mend. Because in the end, the scariest truth wasn't just that one man was wrongfully imprisoned. It was that the system that put him there was still in use.